Okay, so we are continuing our look at Bram Stoker's Dracula, and we're picking up here with the journal entry from one of the main characters, Jonathan Harker, and he is staying at the Golden Krone Hotel in Bistritz, and this is a fairly short entry, so we'll just read it. But again, there are some things here that are going to establish the story as it moves forward. So, 4th of May. This is Jonathan Harker writing in his journal. I found that my landlord had got a letter from the Count, this is Dracula, directing him to secure the best place on the coach for me. But on making inquiries as to details, he seemed somewhat reticent and pretended that he could not understand my German. This could not be true, because up to then he had understood it perfectly. At least he answered my questions exactly as if he did. He and his wife, the old lady who had received me, looked at each other in a frightened sort of way. He mumbled out that the money had been sent in a letter, and that was all he knew. When I asked him if he knew Count Dracula and could tell me anything of his castle, both he and his wife crossed themselves, and saying that they knew nothing at all, simply refused to speak further. It was so near the time of starting that I had no time to ask anyone else, for it was all very mysterious and not by any means comforting. So I'm going to pause here for a second. This crossing of themselves is going to be something is going to become very prominent in the next journal entry, and so we'll wait for the next video to delve into that a little bit, but just get used to seeing this a lot, because this is going to be a very Eastern Orthodox part of Europe, and crossing yourself in the Catholic tradition is a very normal thing to do whenever evil is presented. But we'll delve into that with the next video. Continuing on. Just before I was leaving, the old lady came up to my room and said in a very hysterical way, "Must you go? Oh, young Herr, must you go?" She was in such an excited state that she seemed to have lost her grip of what German she knew, and mixed it all up with some other language which I did not know at all. I was just able to follow her by asking many questions. When I told her that I must go at once, and that I was engaged on important business, she asked again, "Do you know what day it is?" I answered that it was the 4th of May. She shook her head as she said again, "Oh yes, I know that. I know that. But do you know what day it is?" On my saying that I did not understand, she went on, "It is the eve of St. George's Day. Do you not know that tonight, when the clock strikes midnight, all the evil things in the world will have full sway? Do you know where you are going and what you are going to?" She was in such evident distress that I tried to comfort her, but without effect. Alright, so I'm going to pause here for a minute, because we want to take a look at this St. George's Day. The Eastern Church commemorates this date differently than here in the West. In the West, especially in England, where St. George's Day is a major feast day, being the patron saint of England, it occurs on the 23rd of April. But in the Eastern Church, it takes place presently on the 6th of May. Now, why do I say presently? Because we must remember that the Eastern Orthodox Church is synced to the Gregorian calendar, not to the Julian calendar. The West uses the Julian calendar, and I'll not get into all those kinds of things. But suffice to say that the church seasons in the Eastern Church run a bit different than they do in the Western Church. Now, you might have heard me say that it's the 6th of May. That is when the Eastern churches celebrate St. George's Day. And yet, in the book, the 4th of May is considered the eve of St. George's feast day. So what's this discrepancy? What's going on? Well, because of the way the Gregorian calendar works, every couple hundred years, I guess, I don't know if there's an exact date, but every couple hundred years, the calendar is offset. So basically, whatever occurs in the Western calendar, which uses the Julian calendar, occurs a certain number of days offset. So, in the present day, the St. George's Day in the West takes place the 23rd of April, and the Gregorian calendar takes 13 days added onto that. So that's how we end up with the 6th of May. However, in the 19th century, in 1897, when this story takes place, the discrepancy between the Julian and Gregorian calendars is only 12 days. And in the year 2100, when the 22nd century begins, assuming we're all still here, the discrepancy between the Julian and Gregorian calendars will be 14 days. So I'm sure I'm not really sure of the science behind all that working out, but I'm just making sure that we all understand why in the book, when Bram Stoker wrote it, why it seems as though the book is a day off from St. George's Day. Now, as to the day itself, it's very interesting. There are these superstitions that has come into the culture about St. George's Day, about the eve of St. George's Day, that such evil comes out at the strike of midnight. So the belief is generally that vampires, witches, other evil creatures must or do gather all their evil power between midnight and the dawn of St. George's Day. So from midnight until maybe 5 a.m. or so, such as the superstition, the worst evil of the cosmos manifests. And so there are various practices that these cultures I don't know if they still have this. I'm sure that there are parts of Eastern Europe and parts of the Eastern Church that this superstition continues. And what are we to say? I mean, it's a superstition, but we can't really judge it. We don't live in those parts, and certainly Christians agree that evil is real. I can't say whether it's a good thing to have a fear that evil can grow to such an extent that a Christian should be afraid of it, since we live in Christ and his banner flies over us. We fear no evil, no matter the hour, no matter the day. But these kinds of superstitions still take hold. And so I think it's more interesting to see how this connects to what St. George is all about. Now, St. George is, according to church tradition, he is well, a knight, I guess, if you want to call it that. But he's from the early church. He is said to have lived in the very latter part of the 3rd century, and according to his feast day, he died on the 23rd of April, 303. Not a lot is known about St. George, but of course what is known about him the most is that he slayed a dragon. And this is significant because the devil is often portrayed in sacred art and in literature as being a dragon. So St. George is a Christological persona of history who represents Jesus slaying the devil on Calvary on Good Friday. And so that's one of the reasons why his feast day is so important. Supposedly he's even venerated in the Muslim world, which is interesting. I don't know exactly what that's all about. But suffice to say that he's a very important figure in the Christian church, even though we don't know a lot about him. And it makes sense for Stoker to use this feast day in Dracula, because here, very early on in the book, he wants us to be fully immersed in this driving theme of not just good versus evil, but light versus dark, of Christianity versus the devil. This is very stark. You cannot miss this. You cannot overlook this unless you deliberately want to de-Christianize the story. We continue to read. Finally, the old lady went down on her knees and implored me not to go, at least to wait a day or two before starting. It was all very ridiculous, but I did not feel comfortable. However, there was business to be done, and I could allow nothing to interfere with it. I therefore tried to raise her up, and said as gravely as I could that I thanked her, but my duty was imperative and that I must go. She then rose and dried her eyes, and taking a crucifix from her neck offered it to me. I did not know what to do, for as an English churchman I have been taught to regard such things as in some measure idolatrous, and yet it seemed so ungracious to refuse an old lady meaning so well, and in such a state of mind. She saw, I suppose, the doubt in my face, for she put the rosary around my neck and said, "For your mother's sake," and went out of the room. I am writing up this part of the diary whilst I am waiting for the coach, which is, of course, late, and the crucifix is still round my neck. Whether it is the old lady's fear, or the many ghostly traditions of this place, or the crucifix itself, I do not know, but I am not feeling nearly as easy in my mind as usual. If this book should ever reach Mina before I do, let it bring my goodbye. Here comes the coach. Okay, so we should take up this thing with Jonathan Harker and the crucifix, because it's another underlying context that Bram Stoker's trying to get across. So he receives this crucifix, and we have to look at this from the perspective of Catholicism versus Protestantism. So Harker calls himself an English churchman, and he seems uncomfortable with the crucifix because he's been taught to regard such things as in some measure idolatrous. So we have here two Christian worldviews colliding. We have the Calvinism of Harker. So because he's an English churchman, that would mean he's Anglican. And the Calvinistic tradition tends to be connected rather deeply to Anglicanism. So in the Calvinist tradition, crucifixes are forbidden because they are considered breaking the commandment, thou shalt have no graven images. And we're not going to get into all the theology behind all this. We can, if anyone would like to. But for the purpose of this story, the crucifix is giving Harker pause because according to his Calvinistic upbringing, crucifixes are breaking the first commandment, or the second commandment, in the Calvinistic tradition. Even the commandments are numbered a bit differently between Catholicism and Protestantism. So that's why he's given pause. Now, later on, and we'll get back to this, we're going to learn that Stoker isn't only calling out here Calvinism, but he's going to be also calling out the fact that Harker, his Christianity isn't a full-on, robust, steadfast Christianity. I'm not saying Harker's not Christian. I am saying he's got a kind of superficial Christianity. He's probably a guy that enjoys his Christian, or his Christmas, Easter services. He might be in church once a month. He might receive the Eucharist out of a casual, that's just what Christians do. But you're going to kind of find out that Harker, and Harker's not the only one with this problem, that Harker has a very loose grasp on his faith. And I think that's really what he's getting to when he says, whether it is the old lady's fear or the many ghostly traditions of this place or the crucifix itself, I do not know, but I am not feeling nearly as easy in my mind as usual. Here we have a rationalist Christian. That's what Calvinism, that's really at the heart of what Calvinism is. It's a rationalist approach to the Christian faith, and in that context, he's being met for the first time, he's detecting for the first time as a Christian man a real Christian spiritual battle. Even though he doesn't know that's what he's about to enter into, the crucifix is automatically, it's kind of, the crucifix is his portal. It's kind of his, I hesitate to use the word talisman because I'm not really sure that's an appropriate word. But in effect, it's his artifact that is going to connect him to what has been before this an unseen world. So we might even think of Narnia, the Pevensies, being brought into this new land that has been hidden before their eyes. So Harker is about to get brought into a real spiritual landscape with this crucifix. This crucifix is kind of his key. Now, as a Lutheran, I have to speak to the crucifix because I adore the crucifix. I have crucifixes in my house. I have, one of my favorite gifts is an icon of Christ on the cross that was bought by my brother-in-law when he went to Jerusalem. I don't know if he bought it in Jerusalem. I know he bought it when he was in the Holy Land. About, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago now or so. So I love the crucifix. And that might surprise some folks because Lutherans are considered Protestants. But in fact, Lutherans are Catholics. We are Catholics in exile, I guess. We are evangelical Catholics. We are Catholics. And so the crucifix is not something that we shy away from. And I'm going to read to you some things from Luther. These first two quotes are from sermons on the Gospel of John that he gave. So, in this particular sermon, on chapters 1 to 4 of John, Luther writes, "The custom of holding a crucifix before a dying person has kept many in the Christian faith and has enabled them to die with a confident faith in the crucified Christ." Here's another quote from his sermon on John chapters 6 through 8. Quote, "It was a good practice to hold a wooden crucifix before the eyes of the dying or to press it into their hands. This brought the suffering and death of Christ to mind and comforted the dying. But the others, who haughtily relied on their good works, entered a heaven that contained a sizzling fire, for they were drawn away from Christ and failed to impress his life-giving passion and death upon their hearts." And finally, this last quote is from his treatise Against the Heavenly Prophets, which he wrote in 1525. By the way, those two sermons, one of them is from 1539, the other one is from 1532. So this is across Luther's body of work. This isn't just Luther at a particular time in his life. This is how Luther always felt about the crucifix. So here he writes in the treatise Against the Heavenly Prophets, which, by the way, is a phenomenal treatise that, although it's directed at the Zwickau prophets, who are causing all kinds of unrest, trying to use the Reformation for basically social justice initiatives. It is baptized in spiritual warfare language, and I heartily recommend it. So Luther writes here in the treatise, "When I hear of Christ, an image of a man hanging on a cross takes form in my heart, just as the reflection of my face naturally appears in the water when I look into it. If it is not a sin, but good to have an image of Christ in my heart, why should it be a sin to have it in my eyes?" Now, here you can kind of hear that he is reacting against this notion, this pietistic, and then eventually rationalist notion that crucifixes are bad. Now, when we say a crucifix, what are we talking about? We're talking about a cross with the Corpus Christi of Jesus, with the corpus of Jesus upon it, clearly. This is where we get the Latin Corpus Christi from. So this isn't an empty cross. This is a cross with the suffering and dying Jesus for our sins clearly upon it. Luther goes on to write in that same treatise, "Now, we do not request more than that one permit us to regard a crucifix or a saint's image as a witness, for remembrance as a sign as that image of Caesar was. Should it not be as possible for us without sin to have a crucifix or an image of Mary as it was for the Jews, and Christ himself to have an image of Caesar, who, pagan and now dead, belonged to the devil? Indeed, the Caesar had coined his image to glorify himself. However, we seek neither to receive nor give honor in this matter, and are yet so strongly condemned, while Christ's possession of such an abominable and shameful image remains uncondemned. And I say at the outset that according to the law of Moses, no other images are forbidden than an image of God which one worships. A crucifix, on the other hand, or any other holy image, is not forbidden. Where, however, images or statues are made without idolatry, then such making of them is not forbidden. My image breakers must also let me keep, wear, and look at a crucifix, or a Madonna, as long as I do not worship them, but only have them as memorials. But images for memorial and witness, such as crucifixes and images of saints, are to be tolerated. And they are not only to be tolerated, but for the sake of the memorial and the witness, they are praiseworthy and honorable. So that was all from Against the Heavenly Prophets. So as you can see in the Lutheran tradition, we not only love crucifixes, we adore them because of what they remind us of. And Jonathan Harker is soon going to find himself very much happy and blessed that he had a crucifix with him, and not necessarily for the tropish reasons that we see in popular adaptations of Dracula, where Dracula comes and you throw a crucifix in front of him and he's just gonna, magically cringe and, as if it is, again, just a mere talisman. This crucifix is going to mean much to Jonathan Harker. And we'll address that when we get there. But it's important here to really understand and grasp that Stoker, in the very early stages of this novel, of this story, is setting up spiritual warfare on multiple levels. And this is a story that he intends to tell of Christian spiritual warfare. And at the center of it is going to be a crucifix and other very profound images and practices of the Christian church.